Diana Harris hated the sound of her own footsteps. Each day, as she walked the 3 blocks from the diner to her tiny apartment, the rhythmic tap of her worn-out sneakers on the pavement reminded her of everything she was running out of. Time, money, and lately, hope. The chilly autumn air bit at her cheeks as she tugged her thin jacket tighter around her. It was the end of her morning shift, and her body ached from hours of balancing heavy trays and forcing smiles at customers who barely looked up from their menus. Her tips had been meager, as usual, and in her mind, she was already calculating how much of her paycheck would go toward the overdue utility bills waiting on her kitchen counter. As she turned the corner onto Maple Street, her thoughts were interrupted by a sharp, muffled groan. Diana's eyes darted to the sidewalk ahead, where an elderly man lay sprawled near the curb, his cane just out of reach. His face was pale, and his hands trembled as he tried, unsuccessfully, to push himself up. "Are you all right?" Diana called, out, rushing toward him. The man looked up, startled but clearly relieved to see someone. I tripped," he stammered, his voice shaky. "The curb caught me off guard, and I couldn't catch myself in time." Diana crouched beside him, gently placing a hand on his shoulder. "Don't move too quickly. Let me help you," she said softly. With her arm supporting him, the man managed to sit upright. He winced, rubbing his knee. "Thank you, young lady. I'd still be lying here if you hadn't come along. Do you think you've broken anything?" Diana asked, concern etched across her face. He shook his head. "No, just a bump and a bruised ego, I think." He chuckled weakly, then added, "I'm Harold Whitman, by the way. Just moved into the neighborhood a few weeks ago." "Diana Harris," she replied with a small smile. "Nice to meet you, Harold, though I wish it were under better circumstances." Harold nodded, his silver hair glinting in the sunlight. He looked to be in his early 80s, with a frail frame and a face lined with years of stories. His hands, slightly shaky, clutched at her arm as he tried to stand. "I think I can manage now," he said, though his wobbling knees told a different story. "Let me walk you home," Diana insisted. "Oh no, I couldn't trouble you like that," Harold began, but Diana interrupted him with a firm shake of her head. "It's no trouble," she said. "Really, I'd feel awful leaving you here to struggle on your own." Harold hesitated, then nodded with a grateful smile. "All right. Thank you, Diana. My house is just a few blocks away." As they walked, Harold leaned heavily on his cane and Diana's arm. He moved slowly, each step careful and deliberate. "I'm still getting used to this thing," he said, gesturing to the cane. "My late wife used to scold me for being so stubborn about it. She always said I'd trip over my own feet one day." Diana smiled faintly, sensing the weight of his words. "How long has it been since she passed?" she asked gently. "A little over a year," Harold replied, his voice tinged with sadness. "Doris was my whole world. Losing her has been, well, let's just say it's been an adjustment." "I'm sorry," Diana said quietly. "Thank you," Harold said, his gaze focused, on the ground ahead. "And what about you, Diana? What brings you to this neighborhood?" "I work at the diner down the street," she said. "Been here about 5 years now. It's not much, but it pays the rent. Most of the time, anyway." Harold nodded, sensing there was more to her story, but he didn't press. By the time they reached Harold's house, Diana was struck by how modest it was. The small single-story home was well kept, but unassuming, with a neat row of chrysanthemums lining the front porch. "Would you like to come in for a cup of tea?" Harold asked as he unlocked the door. "It's the least I can do to thank you." Diana hesitated. She was tired, and her to-do list was long, but something about Harold's earnest expression made her pause. "Sure," she said finally. "Tea sounds nice." Inside, the house was cozy and filled with memories. Framed photographs covered the walls, most of them of a smiling woman with kind eyes, whom Diana assumed was Doris. The furniture was dated but comfortable, and the faint scent of lavender lingered in the air. As Harold busied himself in the kitchen, Diana wandered to the living room, her eyes lingering on the photos. There was one of Harold and Doris on their wedding day, another of them holding a baby, and countless others that told the story of a life well lived. She was beautiful, Diana said when Harold returned with 2 steaming mugs of tea. That she was, Harold agreed, his eyes softening. And smart as a whip. Doris had a way of making everyone feel special. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, sipping their tea. Then Harold asked, "So, Diana, do you always go out of your way to help strangers?" She shrugged, a faint blush rising to her cheeks. "I just did what anyone would do." "Not anyone," Harold said firmly. "Kindness like yours is rare these days." Diana smiled, though she felt a pang of guilt. If only Harold knew how much she struggled to keep her own life together. As the afternoon light began to fade, Diana stood to leave. "I should get going," she said, "but if you ever need anything, don't hesitate to call. I'm just down the street." Harold smiled warmly. "Thank you, Diana. You've been a bigger help than you realize." As she stepped out into the crisp autumn air, Diana felt a strange sense of peace. For the first time in a long while, she wasn't thinking about her overdue bills or her aching feet. Instead, she found herself smiling, knowing she'd made someone else's day a little brighter. She didn't know it yet, but her own life was about to change in ways she could never have imagined. The next morning, the sun peeked through Diana's threadbare curtains casting a pale yellow glow across her small apartment. She woke reluctantly, her body still sore from the previous day's double shift. As she swung her legs over the side of the bed, her mind flitted back to Harold. She wondered if his knee was still bothering him and whether he'd managed to rest. After a quick breakfast of toast and coffee, Diana pulled on her uniform and headed out. The diner was only a 10-minute walk away, but she left early, hoping to catch Harold before her shift. She hadn't expected to think about him so much after their brief encounter, but something about the elderly man lingered with her. Maybe it was the loneliness in his eyes, or the way he spoke about Doris with such tender reverence. Whatever it was, she felt an urge to check in on him. As Diana neared Harold's house, she noticed the curtains in the front window were still drawn. For a moment she hesitated, wondering if it was too early to stop by. But then she remembered his slight wobble from the day before and convinced herself it was better to be sure he was all right. She knocked lightly on the door and waited. A few seconds later, the door creaked open, revealing Harold in a plaid robe and slippers. His eyes widened in surprise. "Diana, what are you doing here?" he asked, his voice tinged with both curiosity and delight. "I just wanted to see how you were doing," Diana said, offering a small smile. "I was on my way to work and thought I'd stop by." Harold chuckled. "Well, aren't you full of surprises? Come in, come in." He stepped aside, motioning her into the cozy living room. Diana noticed he was moving more stiffly than the day before. "How's your knee?" she asked as she followed him inside. "Oh, it's nothing to fuss about," Harold said with a dismissive wave of his hand. "Just a little sore. I've had worse, believe me." "Still," Diana frowned, "you should take it easy for a few days. Stay off your feet as much as you can." "I'll try," he said, though the mischievous twinkle in his eyes suggested otherwise. Harold gestured for her to sit on the couch, then shuffled off to the kitchen. "Tea again?" he called over his shoulder. "Actually, I can't stay long," Diana replied. "I have to get to work soon." Harold returned, holding a glass of water instead of tea. "Well, in that case I won't keep you, but it's nice to see a friendly face first thing in the morning." Diana smiled. "If you ever need anything, just let me know." really, even if it's something small, like picking up groceries or running an errand. Harold looked at her thoughtfully, his lips curving into a gentle smile. You're a rare one, Diana. Most people these days wouldn't bother. It's no trouble, Diana said quickly. I mean it. He nodded, his expression softening. All right then, since you offered, I might take you up on that someday. As Diana stood to leave, Harold reached for a small notepad on the side table. Here, he said, scribbling something down and tearing off the page. This is my number. If you're ever passing by and have a moment, give me a call. I'd like to return the favor and have you over for a proper meal sometime. Diana hesitated, looking at the piece of paper in his outstretched hand. She wasn't used to this. People wanting to reciprocate her kindness. But she saw the earnestness in Harold's eyes and took the paper with a nod. Thanks, Harold. I'll call you soon, she said, tucking the note into her pocket. As she walked to the diner, Diana felt a strange warmth in her chest. Her life was far from perfect, but for the first time in a long while, she realized she wasn't entirely alone. The following week, Diana kept her promise. On her day off, she stopped by Harold's house with a bag of groceries. She had picked up a few essentials: bread, milk, eggs, and some fresh fruit, after noticing his nearly empty fridge during her last visit. When Harold opened the door and saw the bag in her hands, his face lit up. Diana, what's this? Just a few things, she said, brushing off his surprised expression. I figured it might save you a trip to the store. Harold chuckled. You're spoiling me now. As they unpacked the groceries in his small kitchen, Harold began telling her more about his life. He explained that he had retired nearly 2 decades ago after selling his manufacturing business. The move to this neighborhood, he admitted, had been an attempt to escape the silence of the large family home he'd shared with Doris. It's strange, Harold said, leaning on the counter. You think you're ready for the quiet, but then it comes, and you realize how loud it is. Diana nodded, her hands busy stacking cans in his pantry. I know what you mean. It's not the same, but I've lived alone for years now. The silence can feel heavy. Harold looked at her with a mix of curiosity and sympathy. You're too young to be alone, Diana. No family nearby? She hesitated, her hands pausing mid-motion. Not really. My parents are gone, and my brother moved to another state a few years ago. We talk sometimes, but it's not the same. Harold's brow furrowed. That sounds lonely, Diana shrugged, forcing a smile. It is what it is. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Harold reached out and patted her hand. Well, you've got me now, young lady. And I don't plan on going anywhere. Diana chuckled, grateful for his attempt to lighten the mood. Thanks, Harold. That means a lot. Over the next few weeks, Diana and Harold settled into an unexpected routine. She stopped by his house whenever she could, helping with small tasks like organizing his mail or picking up prescriptions. In return, Harold shared stories from his past, each one more colorful than the last. One afternoon, as Diana was folding a blanket on Harold's couch, he cleared his throat. Diana, I've been thinking. You've done so much for me lately. I'd like to find a way to return the favor. Diana turned to face him, puzzled. You don't owe me anything, Harold. I'm happy to help. But I do, he insisted. You've brought something into my life that I didn't even realize. I was missing, and I want to do something for you in return. Diana shook her head, laughing softly. I don't need anything, really. Just knowing you're all right is enough for me. Harold frowned, clearly unsatisfied with her answer, but he didn't push the matter. As Diana left that day, she couldn't shake the feeling that Harold was up to something. But what? She had no idea. She was about to find out. 3 weeks had passed since Diana first met Harold, and their lives had become unexpectedly intertwined. Diana's days were still filled with long shifts at the diner, but her evenings often included stopping by Harold's house to check in on him. Whether it was bringing him a loaf of fresh bread from the bakery or simply sitting with him on his porch as the sun dipped below the horizon, their bond continued to deepen. Harold, in turn, had taken to calling Diana once or twice a week, sometimes just to chat, and other times to ask for her help with small tasks around the house. Diana didn't mind. In fact, she found herself looking forward to her visits. Harold's stories, his dry wit, and the warmth of his gratitude made her feel less alone in a world that often felt cold and overwhelming. One afternoon, Diana was wiping down tables at the diner when her phone buzzed in the pocket of her apron. It was Harold. She quickly finished her task and stepped into the back alley to answer. "Hello, Harold," she said, slightly breathless. "Diana, my dear." Harold's voice crackled through the speaker, cheerful as ever. "I hope I'm not interrupting." "Not at all," Diana replied, leaning against the brick wall. "What's up?" "Well, I was wondering if you might stop by after your shift," Harold said. "I have something I'd like to show you." Diana smiled. "Of course. I'll be there around 4. "Wonderful. See you then," Harold said before hanging up. Diana's curiosity was piqued. Harold sounded unusually excited, and she couldn't help but wonder what he had planned. When her shift ended, Diana hurried home to change out of her uniform, then made her way to Harold's house. The late afternoon sun cast a golden glow over the neighborhood as she walked. As she approached Harold's house, she noticed a delivery truck parked in his driveway. A uniformed driver was unloading a large rectangular package wrapped in brown paper. Harold stood on the porch, leaning on his cane, watching the scene with a wide grin. "Diana, perfect timing," Harold called out as she approached. "What's going on?" Diana asked, glancing at the package. "Come inside, and I'll explain," Harold said, his excitement contagious. Once they were seated in the living room, Harold gestured to the package, which the delivery driver had placed carefully by the fireplace. "I'll get to that in a moment," he said. "But first, there's something else." Harold reached into the pocket of his cardigan and pulled out a plain white envelope. He held it out to Diana, his expression unreadable. "What's this?" Diana asked, hesitating, before taking the envelope. "Open it," Harold said simply. Diana carefully tore open the envelope and pulled out a stack of crisp bills. Her eyes widened as she quickly counted the money. $8,000 in total. "Harold, what is this?" she asked, her voice trembling. "It's for you," Harold said, his tone gentle but firm. "I know things haven't been easy. For you, Diana. You've given me so much of your time and kindness, and I wanted to do something to help you in return." Diana's hands shook as she held the stack of bills. "Harold, I can't accept this. It's too much." "Nonsense," Harold said, waving away her protests. "You deserve far more than this for everything you've done for me. You've brought light into my life when I needed it most. This is the least I can do." Tears welled up in Diana's eyes as she struggled to find the right words. "I don't know what to say," she whispered. "I've never had anyone do something like this for me." "Well, now you have," Harold said with a warm smile. "But that's not all." He gestured to the large package by the fireplace. "Open that too." Diana stood and carefully unwrapped the package, revealing a brand new bicycle. It had a sleek frame, a comfortable seat, and a sturdy basket attached to the front. "Harold, this is beautiful," Diana said, running her fingers along the handlebars. "But why?" "I noticed you're always walking everywhere," Harold said. "I thought this might make things a bit easier for you. It's practical and, if I may say so, rather stylish." Diana laughed through her tears. "You've thought of everything, haven't you?" "I've had some time on my hands," Harold said with a wink. As Diana sat back down, clutching the envelope and glancing at the bicycle, Harold's expression grew serious. "There's one more thing," he said. "I have an old friend who owns a restaurant downtown. It's a bit fancier than the diner, and they're always looking for good people. I gave him a call and told him about you. He'd like to meet you for an interview." Diana's jaw dropped. "Harold, I don't know what to say. This is all so much." "Say you'll at least consider it," Harold said, his eyes twinkling. "You've spent so much time helping me, Diana. Let me help you now." Diana nodded, her voice thick with emotion. "I'll consider it. Thank you, Harold, for everything." As they sat together in the fading light of the afternoon, Diana realized that her life was about to change in ways she hadn't dared to dream. Harold had not only given her hope, but also the tools to build a better future. And for the first time in years, she felt like she wasn't walking alone. 2 months had passed since the day Harold handed Diana the envelope and changed her life. The crisp autumn chill had given way to the bite of early winter. But for the first time in years, Diana felt a warmth that no season could take away. The money Harold had given her had been life-altering. She had used part of it to pay off her overdue utility bills, ensuring her apartment would stay warm through the winter. Another portion went toward clearing her credit card debt, which had weighed on her like a stone for years. With what remained, she allowed herself a small splurge, a sturdy pair of boots to keep her feet dry on her long walks to and from work. But the biggest change came a week after Harold's gift, when she nervously walked into the downtown restaurant Harold had mentioned. It was called the Blue Lantern, an elegant place with soft lighting, polished wood floors, and a reputation for excellent service. Harold's friend Mr. Bennett greeted her warmly, shaking her hand and ushering her into his office for a quick interview. "I've known Harold for decades," Mr. Bennett had said, leaning back in his chair with a smile. "If he says you're hardworking and kind, that's all I need to know. We could use someone like you here." The job offer came on the spot. Better hours, better pay, and a chance to work in a place where she could grow. Diana had hesitated. At first, worried about leaving the diner and the familiarity of her old routine, but Harold's voice echoed in her mind. "Say you'll at least consider it." She did more than consider it. She accepted. And now, after a month at the Blue Lantern, she marveled at how much her life had shifted in such a short time. It was a Friday afternoon, her day off, and Diana pedaled her way to Harold's house on the bicycle he had gifted her. The sturdy wheels crunched over the thin layer of frost that coated the streets, and the cold wind nipped at her cheeks. In the basket, she carried a paper bag filled with fresh croissants and a small tin of Harold's favorite Earl Grey tea. When she arrived, Harold was already at the door, wrapped in a thick cardigan and leaning on his cane. His face broke into a wide smile as he saw her. "Diana, my dear, right on time as always," he said, stepping aside to let her in. "I brought you something," Diana said, holding up the paper bag as she entered. "I should have known," Harold chuckled. "You spoil me, you know that?" As Diana unpacked the croissants and set the kettle on the stove, Harold settled into his favorite armchair in the living room. The months had been kind to him, too. His health had improved slightly, and the spark in his eyes had returned. Diana liked to think that their regular visits had something to do with it. Once the tea was ready, Diana joined him in the living room, handing him a steaming mug. "So," Harold began, taking a sip, "how's the new job treating you?" Diana beamed. "It's wonderful, Harold. The people are so kind, and I'm learning so much. I even got my first paycheck last week, and it feels amazing knowing I can finally start saving for the future." Harold nodded, his expression proud. "I knew you'd thrive there. You've always had it in you, Diana. You just needed the right opportunity." "I owe it all to you," Diana said, her voice soft. "You've changed my life, Harold. I don't think I'll ever be able to thank you enough." Harold waved her words away. Nonsense. You did this yourself. All I did was give you a little nudge. No, Diana insisted, her eyes glistening. You gave me more than a nudge. You believed in me when I didn't believe in myself. That means everything. For a moment, they sat in comfortable silence, the only sound the faint ticking of the clock on the mantel. You know, Harold said finally, his tone thoughtful. Doris used to say that the best way to honor the life you've been given is to lift someone else up. I didn't really understand what she meant until I met you. Diana reached over and placed a hand on his. She sounds like she was an incredible woman. She was, Harold said, his voice thick with emotion. And I think she'd be proud of both of us. The room grew quiet again, but it wasn't the heavy silence of loneliness. It was the kind of silence that comes with shared understanding, with knowing that two lives once adrift had found an anchor in each other. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, Diana stood to leave. I should get going, she said, slipping on her coat and scarf. Already? Harold teased, though his eyes twinkled with affection. I'll be back next week, Diana promised. And don't forget, we're decorating your Christmas tree together. I won't take no for an answer. Harold laughed. All right, but only if you let me make my famous hot chocolate. It's a deal, Diana said, grinning. As she pedaled away into the crisp evening air, Diana felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in years. Her life still wasn't perfect. There were still challenges to face and dreams to chase. But for the first time, she felt like she was on solid ground, and she knew she wasn't alone anymore. Back at his house, Harold watched her go from the window, a soft smile on his lips. For the first time since Doris had passed, his home felt warm again. He turned away from the window and sat down in his armchair, his heart lighter than it had been in years. Diana had given him something he hadn't dared hope for, a renewed sense of purpose and the joy of connection.